Thank you, Comrade Kandaya, and thank you, Professor Kulandasamy, for inviting me for this discussion. So first of all, without adhering to too many formalities, I will try to share my thoughts in brief, hoping to further engage in a later discussion if there are any questions. And one of the things that I wanted to say at the beginning is, even though I live outside Sri Lanka, and even though I'm a Sinhalese, I don't belong to the community that is called that normally who call themselves as the Sinhala diaspora. So officially, I'm not part of the Sinhala diaspora. I'm just a Sinhala exile living outside the country, not because I wanted to live outside the country, because I was forced to live outside the country. And therefore, I don't have any thoughts to share with any of the people in the so-called Sinhala diaspora who have now come onto streets to protest against the Sri Lankan government in a very opportunistic manner, in my opinion. The problem is, I mean, the topic that I have been given is too vast and too complex to discuss within a limited time, actually. But having said that, let me make few things clear before proceeding further. Since I am not an economist, I would not try to analyze the kind of serious, grave economic dimension of the crisis. And the crisis is, and also one thing that I wanted to emphasize is the same fact that Mahinda Namal emphasized. The crisis is not simply an economic one, as many seem to be explaining, along the terms of forex crisis, a debt crisis, a cost of living crisis, a fuel crisis, and so on. So I am not denying any of those explanations, and I accept the fact that all these factors actually belong to the crisis. They are components of the crisis. But actually the crisis is bigger than that. And it has a long history than that. It has been simmering longer than 2 years. It contains more components than the economic ones. It surely has an economic one, but it has a long-running political dimension, a social dimension, a cultural dimension, and most importantly, a geopolitical dimension as well. So at the moment, we have reached a point where we all have realized the tunnel has not ended. No one knows even whether we are actually still at the beginning of the tunnel, whether we are in the middle of the tunnel, but surely not at the end. So because of that, actually what I will do is instead of trying to answer the questions that contains in the topic, I will try to formulate a question and share some of the scattered thoughts with you. So then we can, depending on the questions, then we can have a discussion. So in my opinion, actually, in simple terms, what we are witnessing at the moment is actually a crisis of the state. It's a crisis at the center of the state. It's a crisis of the so-called post-colonial state of Sri Lanka. And interestingly, when we say post-colonial state, normally it has been understood the state that was constructed after the colonial masters left. But in Sri Lanka's case, the so-called post-colonial state is actually constructed by the colonial masters themselves before leaving. So what we did was actually, in economics, there's a concept called BOT, build, operate, and transfer. And it's a kind of an economic concept, basically, which explains the public-private partnership. But in the case of Sri Lanka state, the same concept applies, which connects the colonial and the post-colonial or the native partnership to continue the state. So the colonial masters actually constructed the state in the way it is now, and then operated it, and then transferred it to the Sinhala ruling class. So this is a crisis that actually happened or that actually simmering exactly in the center of the state. So what we are witnessing at the moment is the logical result of not being able to radically break away from the colonial legacies, away from the colonial structures, which is political as well as economic and geostrategic as well. So when I say it's a crisis of the state, it is actually the Sri Lankan state that is falling apart, not simply the economy. It's the Sri Lankan state that is falling apart. It's falling apart with its oppressive, exclusive, and neo-colonial structures. We are witnessing a period where all political parties formed in the 20th century is actually falling apart and losing the meaning of their existence. And if you know the Sri Lankan history to a certain extent, you will know we had a United National Party, we had a Sri Lanka Freedom Party, we had a Lanka Samasamaja Party, we had a Sri Lanka Communist Party, and we had the New Left, the so-called JVP, the People's Liberation Front, and the NSSP, which is a breakaway group from the LSSP, called Nava Samasamaja Party. So all these parties, basically, they have ceased to exist. There's no UNP anymore. There's no SLFP anymore. There's no LSSP or CP, Sri Lanka Communist Party anymore. There's no NSSP anymore in the same sense that they existed. And the JAP, though it exists, party, it has lost basically its purpose of existence. And JAP has become a platform which can not bring hope for the country, but JAP has become a platform for people to go and express their frustration about the way things are. So when JAP is basically an indicator to understand how deep the crisis is. People join the JVP at the moment, or they share the JAP platform just to say how lost we are. Not to say that we are going to build a different country on this concrete program. No one is saying this is our concrete program. Instead, they go onto JVP platform and say how disillusioned, how frustrated we are. And the JAP, though it exists, as I said, even the JAP does not know which class or which demands they are championing. Is it a party of the rural peasants as it used to be in the 70s and the 60s? Or is it a party of the urban workers? Or is it a party of the urban and semi-urban middle class? Is it a party of the youth and the students? No one seems to know the answer, including the JAP. But it exists. So in short, we have reached, in my opinion, to the end of a certain journey without leaving the tunnel actually. The journey has ended, but we are still inside the tunnel. And that journey is basically the bloodstained path of an ethnocratic, neo-colonial state with a genocidal tendency towards its non-Sinhala Buddhist citizens. As you know, if you are familiar with the Sri Lankan history, it all started with the attacking Muslims in 1915, and then excluding Tamil plantation workers from any kind of state beneficial programs and the state citizen rights, and sending millions of them back to India. And while the remaining workers were forced, even 150 years later, forced to live under slave conditions. And then the genocidal massacres carried out against the Tamil people living in the north and east, as well as in the south. And then it also includes the massacres carried out against 2 generations of less privileged Sinhala youth who rose up in arms against the government, against the state in 1971 once, and then 1987 to 89 the second time. And what we see actually, what links the 20th century of Sri Lanka's history to the 21st century's Sri Lanka's history is actually the state-sanctioned crimes. A state that is only good at committing crimes against its subjects, against its citizens. That's what connects the 2 centuries. There's no other thing that connects us. The only thing is we have piles and piles of dead bodies of the people who were massacred by the state. And so what kept the state, and the important thing is what kept the Sinhala state and the Sinhala society glued together until 2009 was actually the demand for national sovereignty put forward by the Tamil people. This is what kept the Sinhala state with the Sinhala society connected. So when the Tamils fought, the state upheld a kind of a false consciousness that we against them. So we have to exist, we have to think as one, we have to think as a nation, we have to defend the state, because the Tamils want to destroy everything. They want to end the state as the way it is, and they want to end the country as way it is, to redefine the borders of the country, to redefine the ethnic relationships, to redefine how we look at the state and how we look at the other people. All these things, the Tamil sovereignty, the demand for Tamil sovereignty want to end. And therefore, the state basically said to the Sinhalese, we have to think as one. And the Sinhalese found a common interest in the state. And after 2009, the Sinhalese lost basically. Even though everybody thinks the Tamils lost, the Tamils were destroyed. Tamils were destroyed. But it was the Sinhalese who lost. And that lost, what we are seeing in slow motion, is actually the gravity of that loss. What we are seeing in slow motion for last 13 years is the gravity of the loss of the Sinhalese. And that loss includes the collapse of the traditional parties in the country, both on the left and the right. They have lost their meaning to exist. And nobody knows who is on the left and who is on the right. And nobody knows whose economic policy is left-wing and whose economic policy is right-wing. Now, as Mahinda Namal said, it was just 2 days ago, the JVP, the most left-wing kind of, as according to the way people understand, one of the left-wing options, left-wing alternatives in the country, openly said the most corrupt billionaire in the country is actually will get corrupted if he joins the government. This is what they said. So they think the richest man in the country is not corrupted man. He will only get corrupted if he joins the government. So this is how the so-called left-wing parties think. So in that sense, all this meaning, this loss of the Sinhalese means we have lost meaning of everything. Meaning of political parties, meaning of the state, meaning of ethnic solidarity, meaning of justice. We have lost meaning of all these things. And all of a sudden, all the Sinhalese are on the streets. There are Tamils as well as Muslims who are also hit by the current economic crisis. But mostly, the Sinhalese who have never taken a position against the state, have never taken a position against the criminal character of the state, have come onto the streets. So one thing is quite historical when you look at the ongoing protest campaigns, and that is since 1948, if the Sinhalese have come onto streets unorganized, in an unorganized manner, without being led by any political parties, if the Sinhalese have come onto streets throughout the last 75 years, that is only to attack the Tamils or the Muslims or at times the Christians. They have come onto streets in organized manner. For example, in the 1953 Great Hartal, they came onto the streets under the leadership of left parties to basically to challenge the government. And they have come onto streets in the 1971 to fight against the government, but that was under a certain leadership. This is the first time in the Sri Lanka's history the Sinhalese have come onto streets without a leadership, without being governed, without being led by a political party, to challenge the government, not to attack the Tamils, not to attack the Muslims, but to challenge the government. So in that sense, this is historical. So what I wanted to say is in 2009, what happened was that marked an end. Everybody thought that was the end of the LTT. Everybody thought that was the end of the Tamil demand for national sovereignty, for right to self-determination. But actually that was the end of the Sinhalese that was the end of the Sinhalese belief that the state and ourselves are one. We are one. The state represents our interest and we basically exist because of the state. That sort of false consciousness came to an end. And now we don't know how to get rid of that state. Because the efficiency of the state throughout the past decades, the efficiency was not its economic efficiency, not its political efficiency, but its efficiency to oppress, its efficiency to kill, its efficiency to commit crimes is the efficiency of the state. That has been the efficiency. And that is exactly why Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who has no political experience at all, got elected to become the executive president of the country. Because everybody thought he's an efficient person, not because he had showed any kind of efficiency in governance, but he was efficient in commanding crimes. He was quite efficient in that. And people thought, this is the guy who could lead the country. And we are here now. So the efficiency of its military, which is the killing machine in Sri Lanka, is seen as the efficiency of the state. So the thing is actually, the only group of people who have not lost the meaning of their demand. The meaning of their demand, the only people who have not lost the meaning are the Tamil people. They have a meaning, no matter how destroyed they are, no matter how defeated they may feel, the meaning of the demand is still intact. But all the other demands in the Sinhala society, the Sinhala Buddhist society, has lost its meaning. And we don't know actually who will, the general feeling is, nobody knows actually. We want Rajapaksa family to go home without knowing what after. So what afterwards? And it was nicely put, it was quite nicely put on social media by someone who once said, everybody wants to get rid of the lion, the Rajapaksa, the lion, but not to blow up the cave that we live in. Everybody is fed up living in the cave, but they think what we should do is not to reimagine how our state should be. But we think what we should do is to get rid of this lion and find a different lion. And that is what the ongoing struggle is all about. Despite the fact that I admire the courage shown by certain people like the trade unions, the students, but in an overall sense, if you look deeper into the political meaning of the ongoing campaigns and the political meaning of the slogans that have been raised by the protesters, you don't see any kind of profound understanding of the crisis that we are in. So the state waged war against its people since the so-called independence, carried out pogroms against the Tamils, against the Muslims, committed genocidal crimes against the Tamils, and also committed crimes against its own Sinhala Buddhist people. And now we are focusing on the corruption of one family, leaving out the criminal history of the state. And that is the fault line. That is where we have basically lost the plot. As long as we don't see the most important dimension of the state, which is the criminal dimension of the state, which is being backed by the big powers, the regional and the global powers, we are completely lost. We don't know. The only thing that bounds us together at this moment is the frustration. Not because that we know what will happen to us afterwards, but because of frustration, we have come together, which is quite clearly put yesterday, I think. The International Monetary Fund delegation, a delegation from the International Monetary Fund is now in the country. And just day before yesterday, midnight, the protesters actually blocked certain roads. And then the next day they were accused They blocked the road, which was going to be used by the International Monetary Fund delegation. They were using that. I mean, they were basically going to the central bank using that road, and that protesters basically blocked the IMF delegation from finding a solution by holding a discussion. And all of a sudden, because of this accusation, the protesters held a press conference yesterday or today or yesterday, I think, and said, if we knew it was the IMF delegation, we would have actually saluted them and we would have allowed them to go. And it shows the kind of understanding of the protesters about the depth of the crisis. And they think when the IMF comes, we should basically salute them and welcome them. And our protest has nothing to do with any of the proposals that is going to be put forward by the IMF, because we have basically, there's no political consciousness. There's anger, accumulated anger. There's accumulated anger and there's frustration, but no political wisdom. And that is where we are. So actually, instead of answering the question, what I have done is basically trying to point out the boundaries of the problem, not to provide an answer, but to mark the boundaries of the problem, because it's so vast and so complex. And I hope I have shared some useful thoughts. And if there's any questions, I can answer the questions. Thank you.
Boma studi Soria. Oyage